Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we shall be discussing Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Dear students, we all know that ozone layer is a shield, protective shield in the stratosphere of the earth which protects us from harmful ultraviolet UV radiations of the sun. It saves us, but then due to the man-made chemicals, the research scientific data showed that in 1985 that there was a huge hole over Antarctica in the ozone layer which was caused by man-made chemicals. These man-made chemicals in the form of chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs as they are usually referred to created a big hole over Antarctica, and this alarmed various nations to take protective steps so that the human environment and human life can be saved from the ultraviolet UV radiation of the sun. Around by this, 20 countries of the world, of which major CFC producers were there, they entered into a Vienna conference in 1985. The purpose of this conference was to provide a legal framework for saving the mankind from the UV radiation. In this context, in 1987, Montreal Protocol was enacted. Since Vienna Conference was only provided a general framework, and it is referred to as a framework treaty only, framework convention only. It did not provide any legally binding liabilities of the states. Therefore, it was the requirement, it was the need that some legally binding instrument be created, which instrument can save the people or can impose the liabilities on the states, so that the liabilities of the activities of the human beings can be limited in such a manner that these harmful man-made chemicals like chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs, their emission can be limited to a great extent. Because if left uncontrolled, it would have disastrous consequences on the human environment. Now, in this module, the learning outcome or the learning objective of our discussion shall be to discuss about the provisions of Montreal Protocol, to discuss what are the control measures which are provided by the Montreal Protocol, to also find out that what shall be the non-compliance procedure, that if a state party do not comply with the requirements of or the responsibilities imposed by the Montreal Protocol, what action can be taken and what shall be the procedure. This apart, we shall also be discussing the various amendments which have been made to the Montreal Protocol from time to time. Various amendments have been made starting from 1990 onwards. The protocol was entered into in 1989. Immediately, in 1 year, we had to make another amendment in 1990. Going up to Kigali Amendment of 2016. What was the scope of these amendments? What was discussed in these amendments? And how new control measures were brought about in these amendments? This apart, we shall also be discussing the position of India, how Montreal Protocol is implemented in India. The scheme for our presentation shall be, first we will be introducing the subject, and then we will be having a brief discussion on Vienna Convention of 1985. Then we will be discussing the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, and under this Montreal Protocol we shall be discussing the control measures which have been provided in this protocol, including other measures, the creation of financial mechanism, transfer of technology provisions to help the developing countries to control and regulate the emission of ozone depleting substances, to discuss the non-compliance mechanism, and also we will be discussing in the last the position of India, how Montreal Protocol is implemented in India. Starting with Vienna Convention, because Vienna Convention is the starting point. It is as we said, it is a framework convention. It lays down the general framework and it provides a classification. It basically provides for the future years a framework where the countries, the state parties which have ratified this convention, they can make research, they can be committed to make research on the causes of depletion of the ozone layer, the effects of the depletion of ozone layer. Because if we look at the scenario in 1985 when the hole in the ozone layer was discovered, much of the scientific data was not available. And therefore, the credit absolutely goes to the negotiators at that point of time who were able to convince the countries to come together and enter into a convention, to enter into this kind of a treaty in the absence of reliable and certain scientific data. It was very difficult, of course, and it was not an easy walk in the garden. As soon as the Vienna Convention was thought to be entered into, there were resentment from the producers because they were saying that we are making environmentally safe products and there is no reliable data, certain data, which shows that the chemicals or the products which are made by them, that is causing depletion of ozone layer. However, as we said, that the negotiators were able to enter into a convention or treaty in 1985, which was signed in 1985 and which was entered into force on 22nd of September 1988 between 20 countries. The main aim of this Vienna Convention is to promote cooperation among nations regarding depletion of ozone layer and to promote research and information exchange on the impact of human activities on ozone layer. This convention aims at having a legislative measure in the future, so it provided a framework that in future there can be legislative measures to curb the activities which deplete the ozone layer. But then, as we said, it was a general framework convention. It did not compel the state parties to take sufficient action regarding control on ozone depleting substances. However, it did lay down, it was a major breakthrough, and it did lay down a general framework, and it did lay down a criteria, a method wherein the state parties can come together and they can enter into legally binding instruments. This is the first convention of the UN which has achieved universal ratification. That means it has been ratified by all the countries of the globe. Montreal Protocol is a protocol to the Vienna Convention of 1985. When we say protocol, we essentially mean a treaty which is legally binding, which compels, which basically amends or clarify, or which adds to the convention. So therefore, Montreal Protocol adds to or makes additions thereto, or it clarifies the objectives of Vienna Convention, and it aims to achieve the objectives of the Vienna Convention of furthering, it seeks to further the goals and objectives of Vienna Convention. This Montreal Protocol was agreed on 16 September 1987 and it entered into force on January 1, 1989. That means in 1.5 years from signing the Vienna Convention, Montreal Protocol was entered into. It was agreed between various nations because the entire world community was overawed by the scientific developments which showed that there was a big hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica, triggered by the discovery of this huge hole. This protocol was entered into. Basic aim, as we said, of this Montreal Protocol is to further and achieve the objects and goals of Vienna Convention. It is basically an additional protocol to Vienna Convention for the protection of the ozone layer. Like Vienna Convention, it has also achieved universal ratification. That means it has been consented to by all the countries of the globe, and they have accepted this convention, this protocol, as a legally binding instrument upon them. Now, if we look at this Montreal Protocol, unlike Vienna Convention, which did not lay down specific liabilities of these member nations, Montreal Protocol created legally binding responsibilities on the states. It is based on two very important principles of environmental jurisprudence, that is precautionary principle. If we look at the preamble of the Montreal Protocol itself, it says recognizing the need to protect the earth from the UV radiation and recognizing the need that ozone layer protects us, it acts as a shield between the UV radiations and the earth, and therefore it needs to be protected. and all ODS, that is all ozone depleting substances, they are required to be curbed, controlled and phased out. And the preamble itself talks about precautionary principle. As we said in the beginning, that there was no reliable scientific data in the beginning when the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol was entered into, which clearly showed that the hole in the ozone layer was caused by man-made creation of chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs. Therefore, in the absence of that data, in the absence of the data that the damage is caused by CFCs, man-made CFCs, it acted on that instead of waiting for the scientific knowledge to be improved and find out that this damage is caused by the man-made activities only, let us take precautions so that the ozone layer can be protected. Let us take precautions so that those harmful ozone depleting substances, ODS, can be curbed. Therefore, it is based on that precautionary principle. Another very important principle on which this protocol is based upon is common but differentiated responsibilities. We all know the world is divided into developed countries and developing countries. Developed countries have already exploited the natural and man-made resources, and they are the ones who can be said to be responsible for generation of those substances, for manufacture of those substances, which have actually led to this damage to the ozone layer or hole in the ozone layer. And on the other hand, there are developing countries. Now, these developing countries are still to exploit these resources, and therefore, though the protection of environment is the responsibility of both the developed countries and the developing countries. However, their responsibilities cannot be the same. Their economic development, the level of their capacities to absorb the shocks, to absorb the cost of this, that would be different, and the exploitation of the resources by developed and developing countries are different. Therefore, this protocol identified and recognized the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, where it is laid down that though protection of the ozone layer is a common responsibility, yet there are differentiated responsibilities of the state depending upon the level of their development. The Montreal Protocol, as we said, was enacted to control and curb global emission of substances that deplete the ozone layer or which modify the ozone layer, and ultimately which lead to elimination of ozone depleting substances. Now, if we look at the preamble, as we said, the Montreal Protocol recognized that there can be potential harmful effects of omission of ozone depleting substances on climate change, and therefore it called for the cooperation as well as it called for the control measures for protection of ozone layer and for elimination of those substances which we refer to as ODS, which damage the ozone layer. If we look at this protocol, we find that the special provisions have been made for developing countries. When we will be discussing the control measures, we will find that different schedules have been prescribed for developed countries and for developing countries. For developed countries, the controls call for the elimination of ODS at a much earlier time than those are prescribed for the developing countries. That means they have been given leverage of around 10 years in various provisions for elimination of ozone depleting substances. Not only this, the protocol has established under the London Amendment a multilateral fund to help the developing countries to meet their obligations under this protocol. This apart, this protocol is a very flexible legally binding instrument. It provides for adjustments. Those adjustments can be made without referring it to MOP. The ratification is not required of the members of the meetings of the parties. All the parties of this convention, this protocol, need not ratify when an adjustment is made. There is a difference between adjustment and amendment. Amendment would need the ratification of all the parties or who have signed and ratified this Montreal Protocol, whereas the adjustment do not need the ratification by the parties. It is within the authority given to the meeting of parties that they can make adjustments, and those adjustments would automatically become applicable on all the member states. If we look at the Montreal Protocol, as we said, the basic purpose is to eliminate ozone depleting substances. And therefore, the first important step which was taken under the Montreal Protocol was the phasing out of controlled substances. Immediate ban on all these substances could not have been put. Therefore, schedules were made wherein the time frames were given for the developed and developing countries to phase out the ozone depleting substances. As we said, it is a flexible instrument because the scientific knowledge is increasing day by day, and with the advancement of scientific knowledge and technical know-how, we are coming to know each day that which kind of new chemicals they are impacting the climate, they are impacting the ozone layer. Therefore, the protocol provides for amendments and adjustments, that the new chemicals which are found to be damaging the ozone layer, they can be added to the list and time schedules can be provided for their elimination or for the ban on the trade on those substances. So as we said, that this protocol has created provisions in the form of articles 2A to 2J and has inserted annexes A, B, C, E and F, which provide the time frame for phasing out of controlled substances. These controlled substances are those substances which are found to having an adverse effect on the ozone layer, or which we refer to as ODS, ozone depleting substances, or which are found to have an adverse effect on the climate. This apart, the protocol has banned trade between import or export of controlled substances between non-parties. That means those parties, those states which are not parties to the convention and the Montreal Protocol, a member state cannot have trade with the non-member state. That means they cannot import, they cannot export. Even this served as a great incentive actually, and this is one of the reasons for the great success of this Montreal Protocol, that those parties, those states which are not parties to Montreal Protocol, they can neither import nor export these controlled substances. These controlled substances are required because the consumer comforts are on high demand. We need refrigerators, we need air conditioners, and these requirement of these is greater in the developing countries because there the demand is still being generated, and therefore if they are unable to import or export these substances, controlled substances, they find themselves at a disadvantaged position. And that is why, as we said, that this is one of the reasons for the great success of this Montreal Protocol. Similarly, apart from ban on trade, that is import or export of these controlled substances with non-parties, if we look at Article 4A of the protocol, we find that if a party is unable to, the party to this protocol is unable to cease production of any controlled substance, then in that case it is required to ban the export of the used, recycled and reclaimed quantity of that substance, except for the purpose of destruction. That means even if it is due to domestic reasons, despite taking all efforts, it is unable to cease the production of any controlled substance, it cannot export even the used or recycled or reclaimed quantity of that substance, except for the purpose of destruction of that substance. The protocol has put up a liability of states to introduce the system of licensing of import and export of new, used, recycled and reclaimed controlled substances. If we look at Article 4B, now the purpose of Article 4B is to stop illegal trade and to ensure that the trade of controlled substances which are mentioned in annexes, that takes place only, and to regulate that takes place only with the member states, and that takes place through a system of license. That means each nation should introduce licensing policy and should inform the secretariat of the protocol, that is Ozone Secretariat, about the system of licensing which they have introduced, so that number one, the data can be collected as to the import and export, the trade in controlled substances, and secondly their disposal and the emission levels can be regulated, curtailed and curbed. As we said, Article 7 is providing for recording of data and reporting that data to the Ozone Secretariat. All the member nations are required to supply it to the Ozone Secretariat, the emissions of various controlled substances. This part, Article 9, calls for research, development, public awareness, and exchange of information. And for this purpose, Article 9 solicits cooperation of the parties so that there can be research and development on the causes and effect of ozone depleting substances, and public awareness is created regarding the same, and whatever technical advancements have taken place regarding knowledge of ODS, that be shared. There is information exchange between the developed countries and developing countries. This article provides that for finding out the best technologies for improvement, recovery, recycling or destruction of controlled substances and for controlling their emissions, the cooperation and information exchange between the developed and developing countries is required. And this protocol also calls for alternatives to controlled substances. That means information exchange shall take place on what can be viable alternatives to these controlled substances. The protocol aims and promotes the parties, requires the parties to create public awareness regarding environmental effects of emission of controlled substances, and the parties are required that every 2 years they should submit a summary of the activities undertaken by them for generating public awareness, for generating exchange of information, and also regarding research and development on ozone depleting substances. As we said, various amendments have been made to this protocol. If we see, 6 amendments have been made to this Montreal Protocol. The first amendment was London Amendment of 1990. Then thereafter we had a Copenhagen Amendment of 1992, Vienna Accord of 1995, Montreal Amendment of 1997, Beijing Amendment of 1999, and now the recent Kigali Amendment made in Rwanda in 2016, late 2016. If we look at London Amendment, this is one of the most important amendments to the Montreal Protocol. This amendment was made in the second meeting of parties in 1990, that is on 29th June 1990. It entered into force on 1st of January 1992. It added to the list of controlled substances new controlled substances which were found, which were discovered by the advancement of scientific knowledge to be dangerous to be harmful to ozone layer. That is, it added fully halogenated CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, carbon tetrachloride and methyl chloroform to the list of controlled substances, or to the list of substances which need to be controlled because of their harmful effects on the ozone layer, by adding annexes A and B and by inserting articles 2C, 2D and 2E to the existing Montreal Protocol. This apart, London Amendment called for the elimination of the production and consumption of chlorofluorocarbons, halogens, carbon tetrachloride by January 1, 2010 for developed countries and January 1, 2010 for developing countries. And it also called for complete elimination of production and consumption of methyl chloroform in case of developed countries by January 1st, 2005 and in case of developing countries by January 1st, 2015. If we look at the protocol, there is Article 5. Article 5 clause 1 talks about the developing countries. That means those countries whose per capita consumption of the controlled substance as of date when the protocol was entered into was less than 300 grams per capita. Those countries are called Article 5.1 countries, that is developing countries. Out of total list of 197 countries, 50 countries are Article 5 countries, that is 50 countries are developed countries and balance countries are developing countries. Now, if we look at the London Amendment, it also barred trade with non-parties. As we discussed that there is a provision in Article 4 regarding ban on trade with non-parties. This provision was inserted by the London Amendment of 1990. Most important part of the London Amendment was creation of multilateral fund. This fund was created out of the contributions from the developed countries, and the purpose of the fund was to help developing countries to meet their obligations under the Montreal Protocol. This apart, another amendment was made in 1992, which is referred to as Copenhagen Amendment because it was made in a meeting of parties at Copenhagen. Amendment was agreed to on 25th November 1992. It entered into force on 14th June 1994. The amendment provided for accelerated phase out of consumption and production of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, including fully halogenated CFCs, methyl chloroform and carbon tetrachloride. What the amendment did is it advanced the dates of elimination of these controlled substances, and the new schedule was set out in the Montreal Protocol. This apart, HBFCs, that is hydrobromofluorocarbons and methyl bromide, they were added to the list of controlled substances by inserting articles 2G and 2H by the Copenhagen Amendment. Another controlled substance was added to the Montreal Protocol by inserting article 2F by the Copenhagen Amendment, that is hydrochlorofluorocarbons, that is HCFCs. They were also added to the list of controlled substances. When we look at the third amendment, that is Vienna Accord, this amendment was not required to be ratified by the member nations because these were in the form, majorly in the form of adjustments which were within the existing authority of the Conference of Parties. These amendments were made to phase out consumption of methyl bromide, and therefore the schedule was provided. Similarly, Vienna Accord made adjustments in the phase out schedule of hydrochlorofluorocarbons, that is HCFCs. Montreal Amendment of 1997 was agreed on 17 September 1997. It entered into force on 10th November 1999. It imposed a complete ban on trade in methyl bromide with non-parties. It required all parties to institute a system of licensing for the import and export of all new, used, recycled and reclaimed controlled substances, including methyl bromide, that is under Article 4B. If we look at Beijing Amendment of 1999, which was agreed on 3rd of December 1999 and which entered into force on 25th Feb 2002, then we find that this amendment added bromochloromethane to the list of controlled substances by inserting Article 2I. It banned all trade of HCFCs and bromochloromethane between parties to the amendment and non-parties. That means trade between non-parties of these controlled substances was banned. It also required mandatory annual reporting regarding volumes of methyl bromide used for quarantine purposes and for pre-shipment purposes. One of the most important amendments have been made to the Montreal Protocol in October-November 2016, which was made at a meeting of the parties held on 15th October 2016 in Kigali, Rwanda. This is likely to enter into force on 1st of January 2019, or when at least 20 countries ratify this convention, whichever is later. If by 1st January 2019 20 countries have not ratified this amendment, then it shall enter into force after 90 days when the 20th member ratifies this convention. As we said, this is likely to enter into force on 1st of January 2019. The major contribution of Kigali Amendment is it added HFCs, that is hydrofluorocarbons, to the list of controlled substances by inserting Article 2J, and it has provided a schedule for reduction in the use of HFCs by 80 to 85% by 2040 or 2045. That is, separate time schedules have been provided for developed countries and for developing countries. If we look at the likely contribution of Kigali Amendment, we find that by virtue of this amendment, it is expected to prevent, by phasing out of hydrofluorocarbons, around 105 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gases, which will help to avoid 0.5 degree temperature rise by 2100, that is by 2100. Another important step taken by the Kigali Amendment is that all HCFCs, that is all HCFC facilities which are producing HCFC 22, hydrochlorofluorocarbon 22, they are required to destroy HFC 23 byproducts from 2020 to the maximum extent possible, because these are super greenhouse gases which are having a huge impact on the climate change. Though these are not leading to depletion of the ozone layer, but these were introduced as substitutes of CFCs. But then the scientific data has shown, the latest studies have shown that though these are not damaging the ozone layer to that extent, these are safe, but then they are responsible for global warming and climate change. Hence, the Montreal Protocol, by way of Kigali Amendment, has sought to phase out and eliminate these products and put these products in these substances in the list of controlled substances. We all know that we have a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So let us see the relationship between UNFCCC and the Kigali Amendment. Since UNFCCC is also dealing with climate change, and there are provisions where the parties have made commitments under Articles 4 to 12 of this Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kigali Amendment is not going to affect those commitments, and therefore under that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, HFC emissions are required to be reported under that convention by virtue of Article 4 to 12 of that UNFCCC. However, consumption and production will be controlled under the Montreal Protocol, that is under the Kigali Amendment. Therefore, the reporting shall continue to be there regarding emissions under that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, whereas the control measures of the Montreal Protocol, they shall be applicable. Now, as we said, one of the main contributions of this Montreal Protocol is phasing out of controlled substances. Various controlled substances have been phased out or they are scheduled for phasing out. These are CFCs, that is chlorofluorocarbons, halons, fully halogenated CFCs, methyl chloroform, carbon tetrachloride, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, that is HCFC, hydrobromofluorocarbons, methyl bromide, bromochloromethane, and hydrofluorocarbons. Now let us see the time schedules. So far as CFCs are concerned, that is CFC 11, 12, CFC 113, CFC 114 and CFC 115, they have already been phased out both from developing countries as well as developed countries. In developed countries, they were phased out before 1st January 1996. In developing countries, they have been phased out before 1st January 2010. India has also phased out CFCs, except its use in the manufacture of MDI, that is metered dose inhalers for asthma, and COPD, that is chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. So far as halons are concerned, which are discussed in Article 2B, halon 1211, halon 1301 and halon 2402, they both have been phased out by the developed and developing countries. Developed countries phased them out before 1st January 1994 and developing countries have phased them out by 1st January 2010. Carbon tetrachloride mentioned in Article 2D has also been phased out by both developing and developed countries. So far as other fully halogenated CFCs are concerned, that is CFC 13, CFC 111, CFC 112, 211, 212, 213, 214, 215, 216 and 217. So far as these are concerned, developed countries have phased them out before 1st January 1996 and developing countries have also phased them out by 1st January 2010, except the exemptions in case of medical uses. Article 2E deals with methyl chloroform. These have been phased out by the developed countries before 1st January 1996 and developing countries have phased them out before 1st of January 2015. So far as HCFCs are concerned, there is a list of 40 substances in Annex C Group 1. Their freeze in case of developed countries, freeze was put on 1996 that there will be no increase in the production and consumption of this HCFCs. So far as consumption is concerned, freeze was put in 1996. So as far as production is concerned, freeze was put from 2004. Developed countries were expected to reduce their consumption by 35% of the base level by 1st January 2004, 75% by 1st January 2010, 90% by 1st January 2015, and to phase them out completely, the consumption is to be phased out completely by the developed countries by January 1st, 2020. So far as developing countries are concerned, they were expected to freeze both consumption and production of HCFCs by 2013, and they are required to cut down the consumption of HCFCs by 10% up to 1st January 2015, 35% up to 1st January 2020, 67.5% up to 1st January 2025, and 100% by 1st January 2030. That means developing countries have to phase out completely HCFCs, group 1 annexes, which are referred to as hydrofluorocarbons, chlorofluorocarbons. Now by 2020, whereas developed countries were required to phase them out, the consumption of these substances by 2020. So the developing countries have 10 years leverage for phasing them out. If we look at Article 2F, that is the production of these hydrochlorofluorocarbons, developed countries had to put a freeze by 2024, and they had to reduce the production of these substances by 75% by January 1, 2010, 90% by January 1, 2015, and 100% up to January 1, 2020. Developing countries, they had to put a freeze on the production of these substances by 2013 to reduce the production from the base level by 10% up to January 1, 2015, by 35% up to January 1, 2020, by 67.5% up to January 1, 2025, and to completely stop the production, eliminate the production by January 1, 2030. If we look at 2G, that is hydrobromofluorocarbons, that is HBFC 22B1, these have been completely phased out by developed and developing countries before 1st of January 1996. Similarly, methyl bromide, mentioned in Annex E, Article 2H, they have been phased out by the developed countries before 1st January 2005 and by developing countries before 1st of January 2015. Bromochloromethane, Article 2I, has been phased out before 1st January 2002 by the developed countries, and the same has been phased out by the developing countries by the same date. Now when we look at this Kigali Amendment, which added Article 2J, that is for calling for elimination of or reduction of the consumption and production of hydrofluorocarbons, it has also given a time frame for the there are three groups. One is developed countries, second is developed countries of group 1, and then the developing countries of group 1, and then developing countries group 2. In group 2 we have countries like Bahrain, India, Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. The rest of the developing countries are in group 1, that is developing countries group 1. So far as developing countries group 1 are concerned, they have to put a freeze by 2024 on HFCs, and they have to reduce them by 10% up to 2029, 30% by 2035, 50% 2040, and by 80% up to 2045. Developing countries group 2, which includes India, they have been given 4 years more to put a freeze upon this HFCs, that is they have to freeze them by 2028, reduce their consumption and production by 2032 by 10%, 2037 by 20%, 2042 by 30%, and 2047 by 80%. So far as developed countries are concerned, they have to come at the same level by 2036. That means by 2036 they have to reduce their consumption and production by 85%. So their schedules are by 2019 they have to cut short the by 10%, by 2024 by 40%, 2029 70%, and 2034 80%. Therefore, if we look at Kigali Amendment, its impacts are almost immediate. That means by 2019, as soon as the treaty is entered into force, it will put responsibilities on the developed countries to put a cut on the emissions of HFCs. Now let us look at the financial mechanism under Article 10. Article 10, as we said, by virtue of London Amendment, established multilateral fund. This fund was established to help developing countries to meet their obligations under the protocol. It was established in 1991. Since 1991, Out of this multilateral fund, activities including industrial conversion, technical assistance, training and capacity building have been approved in various developing countries, and the cost of these activities was worth 3.45 billion US dollars. This fund is composed of contributions from the developed countries and is managed by the executive committee, which is having equal representation of developed and developing countries. Its secretariat is at Montreal. As we said, around 3.45 US billion dollars have been approved for the implementation of the projects, including industrial conversion, technical assistance, training and capacity building, so that these controlled substances can be phased out by one and all. The projects and activities which are supported by this MLF, they are implemented by UN agencies like United Nations Environment Programme, United Nations Development Programme, United Nations Industrial Development Organization and the World Bank. Protocol also contains transfer of technology provisions in Article 10A with a view to help those parties which are Article 5.1 parties particularly, that is which are developing countries. The provision is made in the protocol for transfer of technology, and the provision itself states that the transfer of technology shall take place under fair and most favorable conditions to the developing countries, so that the developing countries can meet their obligations under the protocol. Now, as we said, this is a legally binding instrument. If the compliance of the provisions is not made by any state party, Article 8 provides for the procedure for non-compliance. Though nothing is listed in Article 8 as such, it only says the parties in their meeting of, in the conference of the parties, they will decide the procedure, and the procedure has been decided by the conference of the parties or the meeting of the parties. And the non-compliance procedure is, if anybody is having a reservation about non-compliance by a particular state party, he can write, he can make a communication to the conference secretariat. Before that, let us see that for implementing the provisions of the Montreal Protocol, implementation committee of 10 parties have been constituted. The members are to be elected by the meeting of the parties. Their tenure shall be 2 years, and they are eligible for re-election for one immediate consecutive term. Thereafter, if they wish to be made members of this implementation committee, there is required to have at least a gap of 1 year. Implementation committee is required to meet at least twice a year, and as we said, if any person is having a reservation about non-compliance by any state party, he can make a communication to the secretariat. The secretariat will then send this representation to the party whose non-compliance is complained, and that party is required to file its reply. If no reply is sent within 3 months, then a reminder is to be sent to that party, and if a reply is made, then that reply, along with other information supplied by the parties, is required to be sent by the secretariat to the implementation committee as soon as possible, but not later than 6 months. If the secretariat finds itself, when it is preparing the report, that there is non-compliance by a party, it can also request for the information, and if no response is received or if the issue is not resolved, then the secretariat is required to inform the implementation committee and also to include that fact in the report which it is required to submit to the meeting of parties. Implementation committee, after considering the reply and the information received, it is required to send a report to meeting of parties, and in that report it is also required to make its recommendations to help resolve the issue, if any. And this report is required to be sent not later than 6 weeks before the meeting of parties, so that the parties, the member states, can discuss the report of the implementation committee. And then the meeting of party is to decide the future course of action to ensure full compliance with the protocol. There are various indicative list of measures which are provided in the protocol in the non-compliance procedure itself. These are appropriate assistance to that state which has shown non-compliance with the provisions of the Montreal Protocol by assisting them, issuing directions to them, issuing cautions to them, and if none of them works, then a member can be suspended in accordance with the procedure for the suspension from international conventions. Now let us finally look at the implementation of Montreal Protocol in India. India became a party to Vienna Convention on 18th March 1991, and it became party to Montreal Protocol on 19th June 1992. For the implementation of Montreal Protocol, the responsibility has been entrusted to Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change, and MOEF and CC has constituted an empowered steering committee which is chaired by Secretary Environment, Forest and Climate Change. This committee is assisted by two standing committees, that is Technology and Finance Standing Committee and Standing Committee on Monitoring. The Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has also established ozone cell for the implementation of the provisions of Montreal Protocol, and MOEF has also prepared a detailed country plan in 1993 itself to phase out ozone depleting substances. India has met its obligations, complied with its obligations under the Montreal Protocol, and has phased out the production and consumption of chlorofluorocarbons, CTCs, halons. These have already been phased out by 1st January 2010, except their use in pharmaceutical matters, and that too in manufacturing of meter dose inhalers, MDIs for asthma and other diseases. India has also phased out production and consumption of methyl chloroform and methyl bromide. With the help of multilateral fund established under the Montreal Protocol, 304 projects have been approved and funded by the Executive Committee of this multilateral fund for implementation of the Montreal Protocol. A total amount of 27 crore 93 lakhs 42,203 US dollars has been approved by the Executive Committee of the Multilateral Fund to phase out 58,980 ODP tons of ozone depleting substances. To cope up, to comply with its responsibilities under the Montreal Protocol, India has enacted ozone depleting substances regulation and control rules of 2000. And under these rules, curbs have been placed to regulate production, consumption, import and export of ozone depleting substances. Rules provide for compulsory registration of ODS producers, manufacturers of ODS based products, importers, exporters and stockists. Monitoring mechanism has also been established in the form of maintenance of records by these manufacturers, these importers, these exporters and stockists, and periodic filing of returns by them. In compliance with the Montreal Protocol, licensing requirements for import and export of ODS has also been put in place. India has prohibited the use of halons, CTCs, methyl chloroform, methyl bromide, and has also banned import of air conditioning and refrigeration equipments and other products which are using HCFCs, which have been banned. Dear students, therefore, we have learned the provisions of this Montreal Protocol, which is based on precautionary principle and which has applied the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This is one of the most successful international convention and has received universal ratification. We all know we had a Paris Agreement which is likely to come into force in 2020, much celebrated Paris Agreement. But if you compare Paris Agreement and Montreal Protocol or the Kigali Amendment and the Paris Agreement, whereas Paris Agreement does not legally bind countries to their promises to cut emissions, the Montreal Protocol as amended will bind the parties to reduce their HFC reduction schedules from January 2019 itself. And the penalties have also been prescribed for non-compliance. Thank you, students.